There are infinite ways to make the most of low light situations and to get beautiful images using some basic photographic concepts and techniques and just knowing your camera. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Now, some of you may find this really helpful. Some of you may know all of this already and have your own strategies for working in challenging lighting situations. So make sure, if you've got any tips or tricks, to pop them in the comments. I'd love to read through what you guys are doing, and I'm sure it'd really help out a load of the other photographers who are watching this video as well. But now let's get started. My first tip is to get to know the camera kit that you are using. There is nothing more valuable than knowing what your camera is good at and what your camera isn't good at. Now, when it comes to low light performance, what I'd always suggest everyone do with their camera is to just go out and do an ISO test. Pop your camera in a low light situation and just move through your ISO range, taking a shot each time so that you can have a look at it on a computer screen and see just how much noise your camera is generating at each level of ISO. That means you will have a limit in your head to exactly what you're prepared to shoot at. There might be some shots that are so beautiful you only want to shoot to a certain level. And then you might have a subject suddenly appear that you just have to get. It doesn't matter how much noise is in the image. And you'll already know exactly what ISO you'll be prepared to shoot at. And I think that's really useful. Secondly, understand what sort of stabilization you have. Is there anything in the body of your camera? Do you have lens stabilization, or is it just electronic? And test those features. See just how much stabilization you have available to you. Knowing it's 4 stops or 5 stops or 6 stops is great, but it doesn't really mean anything practically. Put them in your hands and see what you're capable of hand holding, and at different zoom lengths too. As an example, with the Canon R5, I could take landscape shots handheld over 2 seconds. I could do a 2-second exposure handheld, which is really impressive because it had incredible image stabilization. But I've used other cameras before at wide focal lengths, 24, 28 mil, and I've been stuck at 1/20th, 1/30th of a second because there's no stabilization and I'm not that steady. So getting to know what you're capable of with your kit can help you understand whether you're going to need to take support with you, maybe keep like a tabletop tripod in your bag, or if you're going out specifically to shoot in the evening, then you may know that you have to take a tripod with you and you can't get away with just hand holding. Now, Aperture is very easy. We all know what aperture our lenses are, it's right on there. However, understanding the limitations of the lenses that you have is really great. If you know you have kind of slow lenses, that's fine, no problem with that. You can still get amazing images, but understanding that and knowing what you're going to need to shoot with those is really important. If you know all of your lenses are kind of slow, then you also know you need to carry a tripod around with you, and maybe it needs to be a really good tripod too. Understanding the limitations of your kit is so important, and that's why through the years we've seen fabulous images from pretty much all cameras, because being a photographer isn't just about spotting the subject and composing it correctly, it's about understanding that sometimes your camera is not going to do what you want it to do. And if you know how it misbehaves or what bits it's not very good at, then you can work around that in order to still get the best shot possible. One thing I always struggle with is I manually change the brightness of my LCD screen, and I'm so bad for it. It's one of my biggest flaws when I'm shooting, is that I sometimes get home after a night shoot and I've shot so many of them quite dark because I manually change my LCD screen in the day to make it brighter, and then I go out and shoot at night and think, look how well I've exposed this image. And it's not well exposed, it's just really well backlit on my screen, which is a problem. Now, to get around that, 1, don't manually change your screen and forget to change it if you're shooting in a different lighting condition. 2, leave it on auto if you're like me and really forgetful. And 3, always use your histogram to check your exposure to make sure you're not shooting too low or too bright. It's there for a reason, use it, don't be like me. My next big tip is to imagine your final edit. Know what you're aiming for, because if you know what you're aiming for, you also know what you can get away with. If you're working with moving subjects in low light, that does create a challenge, but understanding whether you need those subjects to be pin sharp or whether you can make the most of some motion blur, really allows you to get creative with your shutter speed, your ISO and your aperture. It allows you to know whether you can bring the ISO down to control noise a little bit and allow a bit of blur in there, or whether you're going to have to set those settings so that you get your ISO quite high, or maybe whether you can use a shallow depth of field or not. Knowing what your final edit is going to look like can make a huge difference to what you're capable of doing with your camera at the time of shooting. If you are going to have to pop your ISO right up and maybe you're a little bit worried about noise coming through, you can always change your image to black and white. You can maybe check the black and white image using a filter in camera. Pretty much all cameras have a black and white filter built in now, or you can change it in post, of course. But imagine it as black and white and how that's going to look. The noise you get where it comes through as like a coloured noise, that is really unattractive in most instances. But sometimes you can get away with the grain just fine, especially if you are shooting in black and white. So bear that in mind. It can be really, really useful for saving a shot that otherwise may not be one of your favourites. I often find when I'm shooting and things are quite dark, sometimes there might be just like a single point of light, maybe a lamppost or a candle or a torch. That can create quite high dynamic range within the image and make things quite difficult to manage in terms of exposure. This is where the histogram is your friend. Make sure you're not losing too much on the highlights and too much on the lowlights, but you can lose a little bit. Have a think about what naturally you would expect to see overexposed. The centre of a torch, you don't need to see the detail of a bulb in an overall image. The overall image is about your subject, and if you've just got the torch to the side, that little lens, that can be overexposed. The same goes for things like lampposts and candles. It doesn't really matter if that single point of light is overexposed. It matters about the balance of the rest of your image. So just take that into account and you make the most of that histogram that's often built into your camera in order to see just what you're losing in the shadows and in the lighter areas. My last tip is about using different photographic techniques. Now, sometimes things just are a little bit too difficult, or maybe you just want to get a bit creative. One of my personal favourites for shooting in challenging or low light is to make the most of long exposures, really upping your shutter speed. Stick your timer on like 2 seconds so that you don't get any camera shake, or if you've got a timer that you can use, or maybe the app on your phone, do that so that you don't introduce extra shake. And then just do a long exposure and see what you get. Nowadays, it's so easy to just experiment with it in camera. Obviously, there are rules that you can figure out for the amount of light that you have available. But to be honest, just shoot, see what you get. It works so well over bodies of water. You can shoot where it's really busy with lots of people and you get this sort of ghosting effect. There's the very, very well-known one of shooting on a bridge when you've got cars going underneath. There's so many great things that you can do with long exposures that it can kind of make any low light situation look really cool if you get that exposure just right. If a scene is just too dark, remember you can introduce light. It doesn't have to be in the form of a massive LED panel or big strobes. You can just use a little pocket torch. Painting in light, especially in long exposures, is really easy. Now, it might not look perfect straight away, but it's something to experiment with and it can really add to an image. It doesn't have to look overdone. You can do it in a really subtle way too. If the dynamic range in an image is just too much, then remember you can shoot silhouettes. You can really drop out any shadows or blacks in that situation, and you can just expose for the brighter areas of the image. But when you're shooting a silhouette, it goes back to understanding exactly what your final edit's going to look like. A silhouette has to draw the eye, it has to be a strong form, there has to be a reason for it to be silhouetted. So make sure to take that into account. Don't muddy your images with tones that are too middling, so that when you up your contrast in post, you get these kind of grey tones or these colours that don't allow your subject to punch through the image. Have a think about it as you shoot it, and if you can, try and define exactly the line of the silhouette around it, because if you're struggling with that on the small screen, once you get it bigger, it may just be a little bit messy. When all else fails, there are things like HDR and composite images. You could shoot bracketed, allowing you to shoot like a high exposure, middle exposure and a low exposure and then put those together. Editing software now is so good and there is so much you can do. If you'd like to shoot HDR, a lot of cameras have high dynamic range modes built in, so you can always experiment with those. Again, it comes back to knowing your kit and knowing what it is capable of, and if it looks too overdone or if it's quite a natural thing. And of course you can do HDR on your editing program in post as well. So knowing that these techniques are available to you just gives you a little bit more to work with when lighting conditions become a little bit too difficult. I hope some of this information has been helpful for you. Some of you may know all of this already and you've got some other tips and tricks that you're just dying for me to say and I haven't said. So make sure to pop those in the comments if you have. I love reading through what you guys have been doing and it's great to share it with the community as well. Now, if you've got any questions, again, pop them in the comments. I'll do my best to get back to you with any information that I have on the subject. But for now, a massive thank you for watching, and I hope you join me again soon for some more videos from Wex Photo Video.